Yo, what's up people? Welcome back to Paul's Geography channel. In today's video, we're covering up the top 5 most common misconceptions about the country of Ukraine and its history. So without any further ado, let's get into the video. And yet before we get into the video, here's a little bit of a disclaimer. This is not any sort of agenda. This is simple historical information. That is a fact, alright? So please do not tell me that this is any sort of propaganda. And let's get into it. Alright people, let's start with probably the most common misinformation that Americans like Mr. Peterson tend to use to, manipulate people in America that have lack of knowledge and awareness about history of Ukraine. And that is the thing that Ukraine is not a real nation. It's a fake nation created by the Soviet Union in the early 1920s, and therefore the Ukrainians should surrender their land to the Russians, and it's completely justified. Well, that's a big no-no, and you're not supposed to say that. That's like the N-word. So now in brief explanation, as short as I can put it, I'm gonna try to explain it to you. Well, at first I gotta say that such a demeanor is ideological. It's a press speech of a person who draws information from old Soviet history books, and this is a serious underestimation of the Ukrainian people and their nation. And at the same time, it's an exaggerated overestimation of Russia taking part in the formation of Ukraine as a State Department. Because if you studied some history, you would know that Ukraine went through certain process of a national revival similar to other European countries in nowadays Europe. The land these days known as Ukraine has been through many state departments that didn't necessarily have to be called Ukraine. Just like in Russia, Ukrainian history definitely doesn't begin in 1991, but in the 9th century, during formation of the first Slavic initial state in Europe, known as the Kievan Rus. Ukraine and its history goes on afterwards, not under the rule of Russia, but under Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at least vast majority of Ukraine's territory. Furthermore, the most important barrier of Ukrainian culture were the so-called Cossacks that majority of Ukrainians identify with. In the 19th century, they even made attempts to form an independent state. So these words of Putin and his supporters that Ukraine should be grateful to the Soviet Union for its existence is just a complete nonsense, especially if you consider the history and the fact that the Soviet Union committed a serious crime against humanity in Ukraine in the 1930s that could be considered genocide, the so-called Holodomor. Misconception number 2. Russia has the right to attack Ukraine if NATO at the borders poses a threat. For Russia, of course. So, in theory, war in case of enforcement of your nation's destiny is justified to a certain extent. However, speaking about the national law and Geneva Conventions, the states around the world have an obligation to negotiate diplomatically in first place for a period of at least 6 months before making any rash decisions. Only after 6 months they can invade as an act of self-defense. Russia didn't take any of those actions, so even before the invasion, Russia committed a violation of the international law. Even threatening with weapons is not allowed according to the international law. Alright, misconception number 3. Russian invasion is justified because the Russians are saving their Russian-speaking minority in eastern Ukraine from genocide committed by the Ukrainians. Yet another nonsense that arrogant and uneducated people like to use. Because an excuse to invade a country that Russia uses is that Ukraine is committing genocide on Russians in eastern Ukraine. Now, even if that was true, disclaimer, it is not. It is a serious violation of the international law and Geneva Conventions once again. There is an obligation to solve problems of suspect of genocide peacefully and diplomatically. So in case that Russia has any doubts, Russia is supposed to resolve these issues by a convention Russia is obliged to itself. Even the term itself is just made-up story and manipulation from the Russian government. Russia crossed international peace treaty already in 2014 after illegal annexation of Crimean Peninsula. Russia itself started the conflict in eastern Ukraine in the same year by supporting the Russian separatist army and afterwards cynically blamed Ukraine for committing genocide. A country, in this case Russia, has the right to make such decisions only in case that those apparent crimes would be proven, which is not really the case here. It's almost tragic-comedic to claim those two republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, by yourself as the only country in the world and say that you're saving those two republics created by violent occupation, and you do that in a way of invasion of an independent country. That's just madness. I have no other words. Misconception number 4. Ukraine and Russia were almost facing invasion of NATO forces, and therefore Russia had to make a step to stop it, and NATO is the aggressor fully responsible for this war. Oh man, this is a typical approach of the red-pilled community in the West, and sometimes the opponents of NATO all around the world, especially in the Middle East, which I understand to a certain extent. However, it's in general the people who hate NATO and the West, so they automatically blame them for everything. Those people have this irrational tendency to criticize the Ukrainian integrity and justify Russian invasion. They call President Zelensky traitor of his own people and orthodoxy because he exceeded the EU membership and integration to the Western countries. But unlike in case of Ukrainian sovereign borders, known as the Budapest Memorandum that Russia violated, even though Russia was the main signatory, there is no agreement signed between Russia and Ukraine that prohibits Ukraine from joining NATO and Western alliances. And regardless of this, it's the will of the Ukrainian people and it's what they truly want. They want to be secured from Russia and their invasions. Because if you're concerned, there's been cases of multiple other illegal invasions Russia committed in neighboring countries like for instance Georgia, Chechnya, and the annexation of Crimea in Ukraine, of course. Yeah, because as I told you, Ukraine in its long history went through many bloody wars and national uprisings. Also important to mention the awful genocide systematically committed on Ukrainian civilians by the Soviet government in Moscow. Now, from the more recent history, there have been other major uprisings events, like the famously known Euromaidan, if I pronounce it correctly. And in the current history, we can see the dedication of Ukrainian soldiers and also volunteers from other post-Soviet nations to defend their freedom. Final misconception number 5. Russia can easily call China and Chinese military forces to come and help in Ukrainian conflict. Man, this thing, from simple reasoning, and you don't have to be a genius to figure that out, that this is an absolutely unrealistic scenario. Since China is trying to build its influence by economic power, China needs to cooperate with the most developed countries in the world, especially Western countries that are part of the G7. The economy of China is globalized and makes exports of higher economic value commodities, unlike Russia, that has its exports mainly dependent on natural resources. These good relations between China and Russia are mostly based on Chinese balance between the West and Russia. In the long run, China can economically benefit from this position and negotiate with Russia on cheap import after sanctions on Russia when the country doesn't have much other options. Because in the first weeks, China also suffered some minor damage by disposal of Odessa city as one of the main ports essential for Chinese trade with Europe. So it's very unlikely that China would let its economy decline and go fight for some poor land in eastern Ukraine. Alright guys, that's all about it for today's video. I hope you enjoy it. If you did, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, hit the thumbs up. But I'm not enforcing you. And it's been a while since the last time I uploaded video on this channel. Some mental issues, bro. So let me know down below in the comments if you like this type of content and whether or not I should continue. And goodbye. Have a good day. Yeah, guys, and I almost forgot to mention that If you want to follow my personal life, go down below in the description. I have my personal Instagram. I post personal stuff, so if you're interested,